Welcome to Module 4, Why Does Grand Corruption Win?, where we will look at political will, GRC failure, and broken democracy. In this module, we explain each of these three drivers that allow grand corruption to grow. So, what are the impacts of these drivers and why do they matter? Corruption doesn't just steal money. The UN Convention Against Corruption recognises that corruption undermines democracy and the rule of law and harms society more broadly. When corruption becomes protected, public services and public trust are the first casualties. What does political will really mean? Political will is not a speech. It is evidence. You see political will in outcomes. Who gets investigated, who gets prosecuted, who loses power, and whether stolen value is recovered, especially when the people involved are senior or politically connected. If enforcement only targets the weak, the system sends a message. Power is protection. There's a significant pattern which is obvious in high corruption environments. Selective enforcement is when rules applied hard against outsiders, but they are softly applied against insiders. This is how corruption becomes safe enough to scale. Governance means who decides, who approves, who appoints, and who oversees. Risk means where money, power, and discretion can be abused, like procurement, licensing, customs, and state-owned enterprises. Compliance means what happens when rules are broken, whether consequences are real, consistent, and independent. So what does poor GRC look like? What are the practical signs? The answer put simply is weak controls. Poor GRC looks like missing records, unclear decision right, uncontrolled discretion, weak procurement documentation, repeated audit findings with no corrective action, unmanaged conflicts of interest, and consequence management that stops at mid-level staff. Strong institutions create friction against corruption. Independent audits, real parliamentary scrutiny, credible courts, and regulators that are insulated from undue influence. When those pillars are weakened or captured, corruption moves from opportunistic to organised. Let's now look at democratic breakdown, or when trust collapses. Democratic breakdown accelerates grand corruption because accountability depends on trust. Trust in elections, courts, oversight, and civic space. International IDEA warns that when public confidence in elections is weak, governments lack legitimacy and democratic institutions become empty shells. When legitimacy fails, power relies more on control than consent, and corruption risk rises. Backsliding is when elected leaders weaken safeguards. Democracy can erode from within. International IDEA notes that elected governments can exploit weak legal and institutional frameworks to undermine democratic safeguards. In those environments, accountability bodies become easier to pressure, replace, defund, or intimidate. So how do we measure this? One way to track these conditions is through governance measurement. The World Bank's worldwide governance indicators summarise dimensions like voice and accountability, rule of law, and control of corruption across countries over time. You don't need perfect data. What matters is trajectory. Are safeguards strengthening or weakening? Let's see how we're going with these concepts through a scenario test. Here's the scenario. A country announces a new anti-corruption task force, but senior cases never progress. Auditors are rotated out, procurement records are missing, and election complaints are ignored or delayed. Which drivers do you hear? The answer is all three. So here's our key takeaway for this module. Grand corruption thrives where political will is absent, governance controls are weak, and democratic accountability is compromised. When those conditions combine, impunity becomes the operating environment. Before moving to the next module, we're going to test our knowledge with some quick true or false questions.